You hate to say some people are just born bad. It sounds like a cop out, like we're just being too lazy to try and find out the reasons that a person might live a life of violence. But even William Willie Rudolph's, aka the Missouri Kid's, mama said he was always a bad boy. Welcome to History is Criminal. I'm your host, Mick Biddick. And with me, as ever, is the lovely, lively, unqualified, and unapologetic Kimberly. How are you today, Kimberly?
I'm good, but this guy already has me sighing. Anytime a story starts with born bad, I know it's about to get chaotic. Even though I don't like history and I married someone who does, this episode might actually be interesting. Let's dig into the dirty past again.
Born in 1883 out of wedlock in a rundown house just outside of Stanton, Missouri, in rural Franklin County, his mother, Nancy Jane Olmsted, married Franklin Rudolph, and the 3-year-old Willie adopted his stepfather's surname. By all accounts, his parents, while poor, were honest people who seemed to genuinely love the boy. He was a bright kid. Some even claimed he was brilliant, but was constantly getting into fights at school. And at age 15, he was done with his formal education and also found himself banned from most local stores because of shoplifting. Then at 16, he stepped up his game and took part in the robbery and torture of an elderly couple. Facing serious jail time, young Willie skipped town.
Robbery and torture at 16? This boy said, I'm not here to make friends. He took the express lane straight to the villain of the story.
Well, for the next 4 years, Willie drifted, making money from mining jobs and living off women. It was during this time that he learned how to handle explosives. Landing in St. Louis, he bought a nice suit, cleaned himself up, handsome and intelligent. He was able to gain the confidence of the women he met and was not above allowing them to spend money on him. But when the money ran out, he turned to old habits and was caught robbing a store.
Well, being a gigolo is not a sustainable career path. Charm isn't the currency you can take to the bank. You can't just flirt your way through fraud. It must be a guy thing, and men have been trying to finesse fortunes from wealthy women all throughout history.
Well, it's not a bad way to make a living if you can get
You definitely did not.
it. While in jail, he met George Collins. Collins has been described as the muscle to go with Willie's brains. George knew how to open things with pry bars and skeleton keys, while Willie could blast open safes with the skills he had learned in the mines. While in jail, the two started a scheme on how they could start life of crime once freed. On the 18th of December, 1902, Willie, now 20, returned to his parents' home in Stanton. With him was a friend he introduced as Fred Lewis. This was, of course, George. The two had their eyes on the bank in nearby Union, Missouri.
Ah, yes, the classic fake name. Was George already infamous, or did he just think Fred Lewis sounded more trustworthy for bank robbery or for
Yeah,
robberies in general?
yeah, I think, Fred Lewis, it sounds like a good Midwestern name, right? The Union Bank was a ripe target. It would normally hold upwards of 40,000 cash, about $150,000 in negotiable securities. This would be worth about 7 million in 2025. Even if he could get away with a fraction of that money, he'd be set for life. Willie was smart enough to know that walking in during business hours and waving a gun around would only net them a tiny percentage of the wealth on hand and would have much greater risk. Remember how I said a couple episodes ago that bank robbery is a dumb crime? Well, Willie thought he had a plan to turn the odds in his favor.
Well, look at Willie using his big old brain, still committing a felony, but with strategy. Bless his heart. He's really out there trying to be the valedictorian of dumb crimes.
On Christmas night, the two thieves made their move on the bank. Just after midnight, on the 26th of December, 1902, Willie entered the bank through a broken window. while George stayed outside as lookout. The safe was surprisingly modern for rural Missouri in 1902. It was what a yeggman, an old fashioned term for safecracker, would call a double decker and harnessed, meaning that the heavy doors were reinforced with pressure bars and time locks. In short, burglary proof. But Willie wasn't a safecracker, he was an explosives expert.
Because why just crack a safe when you can detonate one? Really makes you wonder what the career counselor looked like back then. And I suppose his linked ID said something to the effect of freelance demolition technician.
When the first charge went off, George fired a random gunshot in the air and gave a loud shout. The idea was that witnesses would mistake the sound for fireworks and people celebrating Christmas because nothing says the birth of our Lord and Savior like gunfire.
Of course not.
For a moment, it seemed to work as nobody raised an alarm. However, the safe was going to need a second charge of nitroglycerin. It took 15 minutes to set up the second charge. After all, you don't want to blow yourself up. During this pause in the action, a man named Bush, who lived above the hardware store across the street, looked out of his window and saw George outside the bank. Then he noticed that the lantern inside the bank. Bush raised the window to sound the alarm, but as soon as the window went up, George opened fire with a volley of gunfire. Retreating from his window, Bush made his way downstairs. The plan was to get his shotgun and try and hold the robbers long enough for help to arrive. The explosion rattled windows and woke the whole neighborhood. Witnesses claim that George was firing so rapidly from his Colt 45 pistols that they thought he was a dozen men. Anybody who was brave enough to head out in the streets soon found themselves running for cover. As for Bush, he was pinned down in his shop.
Well, that escalated faster than a family group chat on Thanksgiving. George out there playing solo Call of Duty, and poor Bush just wanted to sound the alarm, not star in the Wild West remake of Die Hard, which is a Christmas movie.
Just because you got Christmas lights in a Christmas tree doesn't make it a Christmas movie. After the second explosion, Willie came out of the bank door, smoke billowing from the structure. It was just long enough for him to get a breath and clear his lungs and eyes from the toxic smoke. Then he ran back into the bank and came out with a large bag. Willie and George fled the scene in the confusion and headed back towards Rudolph's home on foot. From there, they headed to Hot Springs, Arkansas, but only stayed for 2 weeks. Once the sheriff deemed it safe to go inside, he and the bank clerk assessed the damage. Willie and George were able to grab up to $15,000 in cash, gold, and silver, and an additional $100,000 in securities, a total of $4.2 million in 2025. At the local telegraph office, a message was sent to the Pinkerton Agency office in New York. The Pinkertons were a private detective agency, or more accurately, a private army that at one point actually outnumbered the U.S. military. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were the preferred muscle of the wealthy and powerful, used for everything from strike breaking to personal protection to hunting down bank robbers. The telegraph read, Vault and safe of First National Bank of Union, Missouri, blown with nitroglycerin. Loss, 15,000 cash, 100,000 negotiable securities. Evidently, the work of a first-class yeggman. No clues, descriptions meager, undecided whether 2 or 4 men participated. More definite information later. Investigation proceeds quickly and thoroughly.
Oh no, they called the Pinkertons basically the OG private army. When you want your bank robbers found faster than your missing car keys, you don't mess around. Seriously, at one point, these guys outnumbered the entire U.S. military. Talk about bringing in a bazooka for a pillow fight.
Yeah, well, Pinkertons they definitely were that private security force, let's say, for the wealthy and powerful. The Pinkertons assigned the case to Charles Schumacher out of their St. Louis office. Schumacher arrived in Union on the 17th of January, having just returned to the U.S. after tracking bank robbers in Mexico. Another reason to go with private security. Borders don't mean anything to them.
Very true.
Launching his investigation, he questioned witnesses, bank employees, and anyone with the slightest connection to the bank. A story soon emerged that two men, matching the meager descriptions of the robbers, boarded a train at St. Clair. For some reason, the two had chosen to return to Stanton. Schumacher was able to track them to a boarding house at a mining camp outside of town. He lacked much evidence, just two men left and returned around the time of the robbery. Of course, Willie was a known troublemaker in the area, so Schumacher had some reason to believe he was on the right track, but he found himself lacking a warrant. He couldn't make an arrest. He returned to Union and used the information to get the proper warrants, then returned with a small posse of deputy sheriffs.
So these two geniuses thought, hey, let's hang out where everyone knows we're troublemakers. Brilliant plan. Schumacher's got nothing but timing and a hunch. But hey, sometimes all you need is a little neighborhood gossip and a good excuse to rally the posse.
News of the Pinkerton agent asking questions traveled fast, even in rural 1903 Missouri. When the posse came to the mining camp, Willie and George were not taken by surprise. The cabin door burst open and a hail of bullets rained down on the posse. One of the first rounds pierced Schumacher's body and he fell dead instantly. The deputies, fearing for their lives, fled, but not before witnessing one of the outlaws pick up Schumacher's gun and empty all 6 rounds into the dead body. Stealing 2 horses they now wanted for murder, fled to Frisco Road, where they abandoned the horses, and from there all traces of them were lost. The local deputies identified the killers as Willie Rudolph, local kid with a history of trouble, and a stranger known as Fred Lewis. More Pinkertons were called in and arrived quickly by train. The detectives conducted a search of the cabin and found 4 flour sacks containing $418 in silver dollars, $15.50 in 50-cent pieces, $2,175 in quarters, $75.50 in dimes, $25.55 in nickels. Apparently, just like me, they really hated carrying loose change and found that
Really, guys? You're going to risk everything for a flour sack full of loose change? Did they figure jingling coins made a better getaway soundtrack?
well, in the old days when they used to actually have money come out of machines, remember going like through Reno or Vegas, and that's ching, it's pretty sound.
It is. It is. I like that sound much better than the piece of paper being printed.
Yes. Also found was what the detectives described as vulgar poetry signed by Willie Rudolph and Fred Lewis. Some also had the name of Fred Ledoux. Another piece had the name George Collins written on it, and a fourth partially burned with Hartford, Connecticut written down. George S. Doherty, lead Pinkerton detective, dispatched 2 detectives to Hartford, but had little hope that the clue would lead to anything. He wasn't disappointed. Detectives and local police turned up nothing. Then Doherty decided to lead the investigation himself and headed to Hartford. He was determined that Fred Lewis had served in the U.S. Army. Hartford kept records of every man from Hartford who had served in the armed forces. While the name Fred Lewis didn't appear in the records, the name Fred LaPlante did, and LaPlante sounded an awful lot like Louis Ledoux. LaPlante had also known to go by George Collins. It was late February 1903, and witnesses claimed to have seen LaPlante in Hartford in the middle of the month. He was in the company of a man matching the description of who the papers had started calling the Missouri Kid, a.k.a. Willie Rudolph.
Okay, hold on. I need a flow chart and a map. Fred Lewis, Fred LaPlante, George Collins, Louis Ledoux, and every man in 1903 just spun a wheel to pick a new name each week. Honestly, this is why I don't like history. And I didn't like it in school either. Too many aliases and not enough snacks.
Well, it could be like England where there's only, four names. There's Henry, William, and George, and they just put extra numbers at the end. So, but LaPlante, who we know as George Collins, and his companion frequented a local saloon where he had announced they had made a fortune buying and selling timberland in Tennessee. The closeness of the name and the large amount of money in the general description led Doherty to believe that these were the right men. The detectives scoured Hartford, and on the 28th of February, they got their first break. A barkeep told them he had seen the two men wandering on Asylum Street. By the way, great name for a road, Asylum Street.
Right? I wonder if there was an actual asylum on that street.
Maybe so. On the 2nd of March, they located the two in the brothel of Madam May Howard. The detectives and local police split into two teams, wanting to take both men simultaneously, also because numerous other criminals frequented as guests of the establishment. They would make a few other arrests at the same time. Knowing the men would be armed, they wanted to catch them out on the street, which seemed safer than a shootout in a brothel. The plan collapsed when George and two other men stepped out of May Howard's brothel with Willie nowhere to be seen. Doherty, in a near panic, knew that Willie would get away if they took George on the street. Leaving the others behind, Doherty ran into the brothel, climbing to the second floor where he spotted Willie. Willie was struggling to pull a Colt 45 from its holster. Doherty had his .38 revolver trained on the outlaw, but he made up his mind to take Willie alive. He leapt at the younger man, who Doherty described as a young, strong country boy over 6 foot tall and 160 pounds. He wrenched the gun from Willie's hand, but in the process lost his own gun. The two ended up rolling on the floor. As they fought, they smashed a sofa, a piano bench, and knocked over a stove. Doherty had been gifted a small billy club by a New York detective. He normally never carried it, but as luck would have it, on this day, it was in his coat pocket.
So let me get this straight. They destroyed the sofa, crushed a piano bench, knocked over a whole stove, rolled around like it was a country fair wrestling finals, and then, plot twist, Doherty whips out a surprise billy club from his coat like chaos-themed party favor. I'm exhausted just hearing this, and very grateful I don't have to clean up the mess.
Yeah, I wonder who had to clean up. And we might actually learn who had to clean this up here real quick. He got the club out and threatened Willie, and it calmed the situation down just long enough for all hell to break loose. Prostitutes, half naked, started screaming, and the house bouncer and housekeeper, described as a large black woman, Doherty's words, not mine, started hitting Doherty with anything they could find. After all, they aren't going to have any clue who this guy is. He just attacked one of their clients. Meanwhile, a similar scene played out on the street in front of the brothel. Doherty was able to get both guns from the floor, and the fighting quickly stopped. Both robbers and a slew of other criminals were taken to police headquarters. Willie was carrying over $2,000 in cash, and George $16. Not sure if George had already paid
his money.
spent his money at the brothel, and Willie hadn't got, I don't know, but still, that doesn't seem like a very even split.
No.
Each man had a Colt 45 pistol, a box of cartridges. They searched the rented room of the two thieves and discovered $8,500 in gold and cash, plus fuses, detonators, a cache of weapons, and in Willie's trunk, they found Schumacher's gun. The next day, school children were allowed to come and see the guns, fuses, and detonators, a kind of criminal field trip. Adults came to see the prisoners, now known simply as Black Frank and the Missouri Kid. The sheriff from Union came to escort the two back to Missouri for trial. Doherty and a handful of other agents accompanied the sheriff and his prisoner on their train ride. Journalists and gawkers also boarded the train. It was a circus like atmosphere. When they arrived in St. Louis, 10,000 people met the train. Troops on horseback and hundreds on foot led the procession to the prison.
Because when the circus literally comes to town, you grab the kids and make a day of it. Nothing says wholesome field trip like letting school kids poke around dynamite and stolen guns. I guess entertainment was real limited back then. No Netflix, just a public perp walk with 10,000 of your closest gawking neighbors. Can you imagine this happening today? There'd be hashtags, TikToks, and a four-part docu-series before it even got to the train.
On the 6th of July, news broke that Willie Rudolph had escaped from prison. That same week, the trial started for George Collins. While Willie ran free, George, aka Black Frank, aka Fred Lewis, aka all the other AKAs, was found guilty and sentenced to hang on the 17th of March, 1904. Willie somehow managed to climb 60 feet to a skylight in the prison, then made his way across the roof, leapt down to the roof of the chapel, and then dropped 20 feet to the street below before he walked off. Now, to give you an idea of what people kind of thought of bank robbers back in the day, many claim that he actually leapt off the 60-foot high roof, landed on the ground unscathed, and simply walked off. But it was later determined he actually dropped to the church, then to the ground, but still 20 feet to the ground, you know, I know it'd shatter my hips like glass. He did all this unnoticed by guards. A manhunt followed, but no sign could be found. Pinkertons assumed Willie would return to his old profession of safecracker and ordered that photos of all criminals captured by them in the United States and Canada be sent to the New York office. On the 12th of February, Doherty and other agents were looking through the photos sent in from across the country. An agent dumped the photos sent from Kansas City, Missouri, out on the table. He turned to Doherty and said, "Isn't that the Missouri kid?" Willie, going under the name Charles Gorney, was arrested along with a partner for cracking a safe in Lewisburg, Kansas. He was sitting in a jail cell doing 15 years for burglary. It seemed he was not only drawn back to the Kansas, Missouri area, but also, as predicted, was blowing safes again.
Ah, yes, the old new name, same dumb crime strategy. You'd think after getting paraded through town like a sideshow, Willie might try, oh, I don't know, not blowing up safes for the exact same region. But hey, why keep a low profile when you can just keep proving that you can absolutely cannot teach an old dog new tricks?
It took very little convincing for Kansas to turn Willie over to Missouri. It seems that hanging trumps a 15-year sentence. He was back in Union in time to say goodbye to George, whose hanging was slightly delayed by Willie's trial. While hundreds watched George hang, reportedly Willie never looked out of his cell window. Only 55 minutes after George was hanged, the jury returned a guilty verdict of death sentence for Willie. On hearing the verdict, he said, "It's all right. George is gone. I would just as soon follow suit." George S. Doherty would later write that Willie was hanged just a stone's throw from the bank he had robbed. Appeals pushed the execution date off for more than a year. During that time, Willie wrote William Pinkerton, the head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and asked that he use his influence to have the governor commute a sentence. It's not known how Pinkerton reacted to this. After all, Willie had killed one of his men. What we do know is that Pinkerton never went to the governor, and Willie's sentence was not commuted.
Wait a minute. Didn't he say earlier that his friend was gone and he wanted to follow him? I think he said follow in suit. But now he's writing letters asking for a lighter sentence. That's some top tier emotional inconsistency. Either he had a change of heart or he just wanted to be dramatic without the whole actually dying part.
Well, I think maybe hanging in the abstract, we're going to hang you. He's like, okay, wants to give that nice cool line. Go ahead and do it. And then, when it got closer to actually,
Doing
being
it.
hung, it was like, holy no. On the 8th of May, 1905, Willie was led to the gallows. 200 people, many female admirers, had come to watch the spectacle. Side note here, it's creepy AF that people used to go watch executions. Like, hey, what do you want to do tonight? I heard there's a hanging tonight. It's going to be a good one. He was hung with a short rope, apparently not accounting for his height and weight, so his neck didn't break. He choked for several minutes before finally dying of strangulation.
A public hanging and a bad rope job. Oh, honey, you really know how to court a girl. Nothing gets the heart fluttering like a slow motion execution with 200 of your closest bloodthirsty neighbors. Honestly, what was the vibe? Picnic baskets and a blanket?
Well, if you've ever seen some of those old photos, probably.
I do
Just,
believe they show that in the movies.
yeah, some of those photos from some of the old hangings and lynchings.
Dressed in your Sunday best and
Yeah,
have a picnic.
smiling, having a picnic, watching someone choke. Um, For a brief moment, the Missouri Kid and Black Frank captured the country's imagination at a time when banks were viewed by many as the enemy of the people and the Pinkertons the hired guns of the ruling class. Many saw the Missouri Kid as a folk hero. Yellow journalists sensationalized and romanticized the stories, blurring the line between right and wrong. George S. Doherty's writings on the capture of the Missouri Kid, and even the mother of the Missouri Kid admitted he was always a bad boy, by Larry Wood on History.com. And The Missouri Kid by Stephanie Kim on DailyJournal.com and TrueWestMagazine.com were the majority sources for this episode. This has been History is Criminal. Thanks to my co host, Kimberly. Come back next week when we dig into the convoluted tale of America's greatest traitor, Benedict Arnold. It is way more twisted and stuff than we sometimes got in school. And as always, if you like what you heard, tell a friend. And if not, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.